Hey folks, so welcome to part 2 of my MLA lecture. In part 1 of this video, we looked at MLA format. Now we're going to look at MLA citations and documentation, right? So essentially, how do we cite sources? How do we distinguish between our words, our sentences, and then the sources that we're bringing in? Okay, so I'm going to go back to my Microsoft Word document. Right? And you're going to notice there's some writing on it now. And I'm actually using an evaluation written by a former student, and they evaluated a TED Talk by Adam Minter, and the name of the TED Talk was Who's Really Making a Killing on Junkyard Planet? Okay, so I want to point out a few things that the student did that help to illustrate MLA format and documentation. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this line. In November 13, Adam Minter presented a TED Talk. This line. Okay, so notice that the student presents the author's first and last name one time. For the remainder of the essay, the student simply uses Minter. And so that's what we do when we write in MLA format. We use the author's full name once, and then we use his or her last name for the remainder of the essay. So for example, if you're reviewing or evaluating Majora Carter's TED Talk, then you would say her full name once, and then you would refer to her as Carter. Okay. Another thing, notice that the Who's Really Making a Killing on Junkyard Planet is in quotation marks, right? So why is that? Why is it that sometimes we use italics and sometimes we use quotation marks? Okay, well, the quick and dirty rule for this is if it's a long work, right, a full book, or maybe a lecture series, or a full movie, something big, a newspaper like the New York Times, then you're going to place that in italics. However, for smaller work, like a part of a lecture series, right, or a chapter in a book, or a poem, or a newspaper article, not the whole newspaper, but just the article, something small, you're going to place that in quotation marks. So notice that the student does that. They place the name, the title of the TED Talk in quotation marks. Okay, and then TED Talk, we see that there is this change between TED Talk here and TED Talk here. And I notice that students often do this, but if we actually go to TED Talk, right, the actual TED Talk website, we see that TED, T-E-D, is all caps. So we just want to follow that lead, and I would change it to TED Talk because that's the way that they do it. Okay, so let's go into the student's body paragraph. Okay, and the student does something really well that I want to point out. Okay, so notice their opening line. From the very beginning of his talk, Minter appears rushed and nervous. So they're talking about how he sort of did poorly. They're reviewing him negatively, right? The student then says, for example, he starts off by asking the audience, how many of you know where most of your trash and junk go? Okay, so notice they clearly distinguish between Minter's words and their own. They do this by saying Minter and then he. He starts off by asking the audience. And then when they actually use his words, they use quotation marks. And that is done properly. Now, something that I want to point out is the student is using a question mark, right? Because Adam Minter used a question mark. Question marks go inside the quotation. They've done this right. Now, when you actually end the sentence in MLA format, your period comes after the parentheses. Notice that. And the student has done that correctly. Okay, so they've said he or Minter. They've used quotation marks to quote him, and then notice in parentheses they've actually done the time that he said that. When you're citing a video, as most of you will be, you're going to do it just like this student. So obviously this was towards the beginning of Mentor's lecture, so they just did the seconds from 16 second to 17 second. If it was at the 32-minute mark, they would have done 32 minutes. Let's say it was at the hour and 32-minute mark, they would have done an hour and 32 and 16 to 17 seconds, right? So if you're citing a video, then in parentheses, you're going to put the time that the author or the speaker said that thing, okay? The range of time, I should say. If this was coming from Adam Minter's book, then you would, in parentheses, you would actually do the page number. So let's say it was on page 12. I would just do 12 in parentheses. Now, some of you may be asking the question, well, why didn't you put Minter in parentheses? Like this. Because sometimes you do, right? Sometimes you put author as well as page number. But because I already said Minter and he in my sentence, the student sentence, right? I don't need to repeat that in parentheses. If I had not used his name, right? If I had said a question was asked to the audience, right? Notice here, I haven't actually used Minter's name. So then in parentheses, I would need to do Minter 12 because I didn't actually use Minter in my sentence. Okay? So we call this in-text citations. The citations you do in your actual paper, in your essay. You always, if you're using a quotation, you always need to say where it comes from. So Minter states, Carter makes the point at the beginning of her speech that something like this, that sets up who's about to say that thing. We call this part right here, a tagline. It's like in Facebook, you tag someone who's in the photo, like this is who this is. This is the same thing. You want to tag the person you are citing, like, hey, this is who said it. Major Carter states, Minter acknowledges, Smith argues, right? And then you also always want to do the parenthetical citation, just meaning in parentheses, you want to point out where that comes from, either the page number or the actual, if it's a video, the actual time that was said. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the works cited page. So the works cited page always comes on a new page, right? And you title it works cited, that gets centered. Okay, and so about a year ago, MLA format changed. They created a new edition, right? And I think it actually it's quite a bit simpler. So for a works cited page for MLA format, every sort of type of source, whether that source is a book or a video or a newspaper or a lecture, gets cited the same way. We call these the 9 core elements, and here they are. Now, I'll have this up as a document on Blackboard, so you'll be able to reference this. But notice that for every single type of source, you use the same 9 things. You start with the author, you go with the title of the source, you say the container, any other contributors, like if there's an editor or translator, version, the number, as if there's a magazine, right, the version or the number, the publisher, the publication date, and the location. Now you might be asking, well, what does that mean, the title of the container? What does it mean by the location? Well, let's go ahead and use Adam Minter's TED Talk as an example. So I think author becomes pretty straightforward, right? So in MLA format, you don't actually do an indent. You just start all the way over, and you do a last name, comma, first name. So Minter, comma, Adam, period, right? So I've done that. I've presented the author with the period. Now the title of the source. So the name of his source was Who's Really Making a Killing on Junkyard Planet? So I would say, who's really making a killing on Junkyard Planet? Right? Oh, that's a question mark actually. Okay. And so notice I now have my title of the source. Now what's this title of the container? Well, the container is the bigger thing containing a smaller thing, right? So for example, in a newspaper article, the container of that article is the newspaper, right? It's the bigger thing containing the smaller thing. In a book, let's say you're citing a chapter 2, well, the work would be chapter 2, and the container would be the name of the entire book. So as you can see, not everything's going to have a container. Let's say you're citing an entire book. Well, there's nothing containing it. It is the big work. But for our TED Talk, right, who's really making a killing on Junkyard Planet? Here's our source that we're citing. But think about what's containing the source, meaning where it comes from. Well, the container is TED Talk, right? So then I would put the name of the container, TED Talk, comma, right? We go back. We've done our container, other contributors. Well, it's just Adam Minter speaking. Version, this is his only time. The number, it's the only video. It's not part of a series. The publisher, well, we see that that's TEDx Beijing, right? So I'd want to put that. So TED Talk is the name of the container, but then TED Talk Beijing X, I believe. TED Talk X Beijing. TED Talk X Beijing. Okay. And it'll look a little funny, but, and there we go. So I want to point out that I've gone into my second line, right? So in MLA format, when you go into your second line, you actually do what's called a hanging indent, which means that you indent the second and third line, not the first. Now watch what happens if I press tab. Everything gets moved over. How frustrating, right? So you actually need to hit enter first and then tab over, and that's how you do your hanging indent. So let's continue forward with our citation. So we've done the publisher. We need to find the publication date. See if we can find that. And okay, November 24th, 2015. Notice it took some clicking to find it, so sometimes it's not totally easy. So November 14th, 2015, right? So we have our publication date, and then it says location. And this is a big change with MLA format. For location of web sources, you actually do the URL, right? Which makes it really easy to find things. So I'm just going to copy the URL, go back to my Word document, and paste that in there. And I'll take off the HTTPS. Let's see if that lets us go. Almost. Anything else I can take off? Doesn't appear so. So it's going to have to go on another line. What if I put that together? Nope. So for appearance, I'm going to take off this these last few letters just so you can see what this should look like. So I would put my period at the end there. I would not have it as an actual link. This is what your work cited should look like. Notice I have my author's name, I have the title of the source, I have the container, the publisher, the date, as well as the location or URL. Two other things about works cited. It is alphabetized, so you put it in ABC order, right? So you start with the author's name closest to A, you end with the author's name closest to Z. Another important fact to know, anything that gets cited in your essay should be cited in your works cited page. Sometimes a student will ask me, hey, do I need to cite this? Do I need a works cited page? Well, yes, if you cited something in your paper, you should have a works cited page. Okay, folks, so that's it for my MLA lecture. If you have more questions, I encourage you to look at the MLA guidelines that I've posted on Blackboard, and you can always visit OWL Purdue for more specific questions. For example, if you need to know how to cite a book with multiple authors, OWL Purdue would be able to walk you through that.